What should classical liberal political economists do? By Peter Boettke. Abstract. In 1964 James Buchanan famously asked what should economists do. He argued that economists should focus their intellectual attention on exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. This paper reflects on Buchanan's message and looks at the development of that argument, and its implications in the wake of post-socialist political economy on the one hand, and the post-financial crisis of 2008 on the other. Following Buchanan, the paper argues that classical liberal political economists must embrace the intellectual and practical challenges of the day, and bring a robust theory of political economy to bear on questions of justice, questions of freedom and responsibility, and questions concerning the invisible hand and the appropriate institutional framework which results in peaceful social cooperation and productive specialization in a society of free and responsible individuals. End of abstract. Section 1, Prelude. It is a great honor for me to be part of this celebration of the ideas of James M. Buchanan. I had the great fortune to study with Buchanan in 1984, precisely at a time when he had been strongly rumored to be the favorite to win the Nobel Prize. Though he did not have that honor bestowed upon him then, he eventually did win the prize in 1986. In many ways, I was in the last group of students that studied with him prior to the increasing demands of post-Nobel commitments. I was fortunate for another significant reason. Buchanan's mantra at the time was "Dare to be different." The Center for Study of Public Choice had just moved to George Mason University from Virginia Tech, and he insisted that we should not strive for conventionality in our approach to economics and political economy. Who wants to be, he would say, a pale version of MIT on the Potomac? Buchanan conveyed to us the importance of doing economics with attitude, yet he insisted that we never isolate ourselves, but be professionally engaged, and that, while not being conventional, never adopt intellectual strategies that would result justly in professional isolation. In short, he instilled in students the desire to be bold and creative, but also to be taken seriously as a scholar within the disciplines of philosophy, politics, law, and economics. Buchanan was the type of scholar and teacher who asked questions and challenged conventional wisdom. He also insisted that in order to ask bold questions and challenge standard results, one needed to master the elementary principles of the discipline of economics, most notably the persistent and consistent application of opportunity cost reasoning, and the principle of spontaneous order of the market economy. Students were expected to think and rethink the elementary principles of economics. Borrowing from Herbert Spencer, Buchanan stressed to his students that it takes varied iterations to force alien concepts upon reluctant minds. His message was: learn the elementary principles of economics and the technical implications for applied areas of analysis in public economics and comparative institutional analysis, and then strike out in a bold and creative fashion in theoretical exploration and applied political economy. As a scholar and a teacher, it was obvious that Buchanan had a deep commitment to a particular perspective in political economy methodologically, analytically, and even one might say ideologically. Yet, his approach was not that of a normative political economist, but rather that of positive political economy. This can be seen in his treatment of the status quo and his deployment of the compensation principle. The status quo is not accorded any normative standing in his analysis beyond the simple point that it defines the start state of all analysis of social change. And the compensation principle, in other words voluntary agreement, is the only criteria for social change. The positive political economist's proposals for reform are restricted to those social changes that may be legitimately classified as changes in law, that is, changes in the structural rules under which individuals make choices. Buchanan 1959. Buchanan was the champion of the methodological individualist perspective across the social sciences and even the humanities, given his individualistic and contractarian perspective in political philosophy. Throughout his career, Buchanan was a dogged scholar, but he was never dogmatic, as that would be the ultimate sign of intellectual laziness. Question everything and everyone, nothing is sacred, Buchanan would insist. but he also encouraged us to explore the questions associated with a society of free and responsible individuals and to ponder what rules will enable us to live better together while simultaneously respecting individual autonomy and generating economic prosperity. Finally, as a scholar and a teacher, Buchanan's greatest gift to his students was his ability to convince his students that his academic success was purely a function of work ethic. Kenneth Boulding and Gordon Tullock were two other superstar professors that I studied with at this time, and in both instances replicating their path seemed impossible. Their work, it seemed, was all inspiration, whereas Buchanan's was perspiration. Of course, both impressions were wrong. Boulding and Tullock worked tirelessly at their scholarly craft, and Buchanan was a genius of rare analytical abilities. But his emphasis on work ethic and professionalism was an extremely important gift he gave to those who studied with him. For those slightly out of sync, or in actual fact radically out of sync, with the prevailing wisdom in the economics profession, Buchanan insisted that a successful career and lasting impact was within your grasp if only you were willing to think long and hard enough, and to work on your craft as a writer of scholarly papers. Buchanan often asked us, as a way to stress his point about having a lasting impact, would you rather be an intellectual celebrity in your lifetime, think John Kenneth Galbraith, or write works that could potentially be read 100 or 200 years from now, think Adam Smith? In the way Buchanan communicated this trade-off, and the values he instilled in his students, the preferred choice was obvious. The goal was to strive to produce works that could be potentially read 100 or 200 years from now, even if that meant you would not receive the benefits of academic celebrity in your own lifetime. James Buchanan was a genius as an economist and political economist, but he was also an inspiring teacher. He was my professor, and I consider myself very fortunate to have been touched by greatness. It is indeed a great honor to celebrate his life and scholarship on this occasion. Section 2, Introduction. James M. Buchanan, 1919-2012, pursued an approach to economics and political economy that stressed the following. Economics is about exchange and the institutions within which exchanges take place. The political economist should not act as if he or she were providing advice to a benevolent despot. The positive political economist can combine the reformist zeal that often attracts individuals to the discipline with the scientific demands of positive economic analysis by shifting intellectual attention to the rules of the game. The most important functions that economics plays as a public science is its didactic role in teaching the elementary principles of economics and cultivating an appreciation of the spontaneous order of a market economy so that citizens can become informed participants in democratic decision-making. The contemporary classical liberal political economist, building on this position, must capture the imagination of scholars, intellectuals, and the public concerning a. Justice of the liberal order, b. Freedom and responsibility of the individual within the liberal order, and c. The vision of a self-ordering market economy within the right institutional framework. These focal points in Buchanan's work are interconnected, and are not disparate interests of his. The point of this paper will be to show the interconnections by way of examining arguments in 3 papers that span 3 decades, though I will not address them in chronological order. The 3 papers are What Should Economists Do? 1964, Positive Economics, Welfare Economics, and Political Economy, 1959, and Politics Without Romance, 1979. I will try to highlight the unifying theme in these papers that produces a Buchanan-inspired political economy. From the perspective of this analytical framework, I will then discuss the challenges that Buchanan saw for contemporary classical liberals and the opportunities for meeting those challenges that the collapse of communism and the financial crisis of 2008 represent. I conclude by stressing the continuity as well as the evolution of Buchanan's work in political economy throughout the 8 decades of research output that represent the body of his work. Section 3, The Task of the Political Economist. After World War II, economics was transformed from a tool of social criticism and philosophical understanding to a tool of social control and applied policy engineering. Buchanan was among a handful economists who resisted this transformation. His revered teacher, Frank Knight, actually argued that the idea of the economist as a trained policy expert who could engage in social control was an affront to democratic values, see Knight 1960. One of Buchanan's biggest concerns from the beginning of his career was that this transformation of the discipline would entail the cost of losing the common knowledge of the political economists from decades earlier. This included not only elementary propositions, such as opportunity cost reasoning and the mutually beneficial aspects of trade, but more social philosophical issues with respect to the appropriate institutional framework for a society of free and responsible individuals. As reflected in the citation trail of Buchanan from his earliest professional writings, the common knowledge of the political economists included specific arguments about methodological individualism, and market theory and the price system. There is, as Milton Friedman once insisted, only good economics and bad economics. But what constituted Buchanan's notion of good economics was not only the self-interest postulate and the invisible hand theorem, but the institutional analysis through which the derivation of the invisible hand theorem emerges from the basic behavioral postulate of self-interest. Private property, free pricing and profit and loss accounting all work to signal and direct economic actors to realize the mutual gains from trade. These insights, Buchanan recognized, were found in the 18th-century Scottish moral philosophers David Hume and Adam Smith, the British classical economists David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill, the Austrian school economists Ludwig von Mises, Joseph Schumpeter, F. A. Hayek and Israel Kirtner, and Chicago school tradition of Frank Knight and Henry Simons. The methodological, analytical, and social philosophic contributions of these different strands of economic thought were all part of the common knowledge of the economist and political economist in 1940s, only to be under threat of oblivion by the late 1950s with the rise of an institutionally antiseptic and pure formal theory of market failure and a social engineering perspective on public economics. Buchanan's resistance took on a new significance as a result. In What Should Economists Do? 1964, he argued that the analytical focus on the efficient allocation of resources had resulted in economists turning a blind eye to the very process by which that efficient allocation could reasonably be obtained and the specific institutional environment required for the process to emerge in that direction. It is too intellectually easy to slide from the analytical point about individuals realizing the mutually beneficial gains from trade, and the constant agitation in the market until all those gains from trade are exhausted, to the idea that one can engineer the optimal solution through correct policy designs. This is not only a problem confronted by models of socialist planning, but is endemic in public economic models concerning tax and subsidies to counter market failures, and the regulation of economic affairs. Allocative efficiency is a byproduct of an economic process within a specific institutional setting, not a defining goal of the system. If the economic problem is conceived exclusively as one of allocation, Buchanan warned, then economic study becomes little more than an exercise in applied maximization of a relatively simple computational sort. If this is all there is to economics, the discipline would best be left to applied mathematicians. The advances Buchanan witnessed in economics during the 1940s and 1950s were in fact primarily improvements in computing techniques, in the mathematics of social engineering. In writing What Should Economists Do? Buchanan was trying to insist that these contributions be put in the proper perspective. These developments can be recognized as improvements in the applied mathematics of managerial science, but they are not, and should not be seen as, contributions to economics properly understood. Economists should concentrate their attention on a particular form of human activity, Buchanan argued, and upon the various institutional arrangements that arise as a result of this form of activity. Furthermore, the elementary and basic approach he advocated would place the theory of markets, not the theory of resource allocation, at center stage. The most serious problem with the post-World War II textbook economics that emerged was not that it was unrealistic, as Buchanan is quick to admit all models are abstractions from reality. The scientific question is matching the level of abstraction with the research purpose such that we get models of appropriate abstraction. The textbook consensus by 1960, however, had resulted in a flawed model of the world because of its conversion of individual choice behavior from a social institutional context to a physical computational one. As a result, Buchanan argued, nonsensical social science emerged and the older institutionalist critics of economics proved to be broadly on target in some of their attacks. It was indeed time for a fundamental reconsideration of the economists' project. A market is not competitive, Buchanan argued, by assumption or by construction. A market becomes competitive, and competitive rules come to be established as institutions emerge to place limits on individual behavior patterns. It is this becoming process, brought about by the continuous pressure of human behavior in exchange, that is the central part of our discipline, if we have one, not the dry rot of postulated perfection. Neither maximizing behavior, nor general competitive equilibrium are to Buchanan the defining characteristics of market analysis, but instead the continual evolution of the exchange process that emerges from the Smithian propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. Looking at the economic process through this window, Buchanan argued, results in the recognition that the market does not have an overarching end. The market is not a means to the accomplishment of anything in particular. In this sense it has no teleology at all, it just is an ongoing process of exchange and production. The market is the institutional embodiment of the voluntary exchange processes that are entered into by individuals in their several capacities. That is all there is to it. Individuals are observed to cooperate with one another, to reach agreements, to trade. The network of relationships that emerges or evolves out of this trading process, the institutional framework, is called the market. Economists should be market economists without any normative implication. Learning more about how markets work means learning more about how markets work. But such a straightforward message is not always easy to understand. Economics is about exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. Individuals attracted to economics, however, are often so because they not only want to understand the world but would like to change it for the better. The scientific demand for positive analysis is apparently at odds with the normative impulse that attracts individuals to advanced study in the discipline of economics and political economy. Again, the post-World War II consensus was misleading in that the social engineering embedded in economics as a tool of social control presented formal theory of public economics such that normative theorizing masqueraded as positive analysis. A close reading of Buchanan's A Pure Theory of Government Finance, 1949, will reveal that he had already identified the critical problem from the very beginning of his career. The state is not a single coherent entity, and that entity is not omniscient, omnipotent, and benevolent. This is the origin of Buchanan's rendering of the Wickselian wisdom that economists in the field of public economics cannot act as if they are offering advice to a benevolent despot. Buchanan's paradigmatic exercise is to ask how one does public economics when you do not have recourse to reference to a benevolent and omniscient unified state entity, and furthermore, as he developed in the wake of his critique of Arrow's theorem, there is no coherent social welfare function that can be maximized. Economics as social engineering is illegitimate, yet economics attracts reformers. Untrained reformers are mere ideologues. Whether right or left doesn't matter, ideologues exhibit the sin of intellectual laziness. Buchanan denies the economist as dentist metaphor, and instead argues that the belief in that model of the economist results in a dull profession of ideological eunuchs. On the other hand, Buchanan deplores the demagoguery of the ideological warrior. So, how precisely can the political economists satisfy the reformist zeal that attracts interest, and avoid the pitfalls of social engineering on the one hand, and demagoguery on the other, while maintaining a commitment to positive science? In Positive Economics, Welfare Economics, and Political Economy, 1959, Buchanan presents his solution to this conundrum. In essence, positive political economy is comparative institutional analysis. The positive role that the economist can play in policy formation is one of diagnosing social situations and presenting to the choosing individuals a set of possible changes. The scope for those changes must be limited to those social changes that may legitimately be classified as changes in law, that is, changes in the structural rules under which individuals make choices. In the starkest way possible, it is important to remember that while Smith identified the human propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, Hobbes and others had also identified the human propensity to rape, pillage and plunder unless constrained. Whether men are Smithian or Hobbesian in their behavioral propensities is a function of the rules of the game under which they operate. If the costs of raping, pillaging and plundering are less than the benefits, then the society under examination will indeed resemble the Hobbesian jungle. If the costs of predation are raised, and the benefits of cooperation are greater, then Smithian wealth creation through realizing the mutual gains from trade will be the foundation of the social order. The political economist contributes to science and reform by analyzing alternative institutional arrangements, and offering changes in the rules of the game as hypotheses to be tested in the arena of collective action. In devising such changes in the rules of the game, Buchanan stresses two critical building blocks. The first building block concerns the position of the status quo. The positive political economy of reform must begin with the here and now, and never some imaginary start state where opposition to change is non-existent. In doing this, Buchanan is not attributing any normative weight to the status quo. All he is doing is insisting that it is what it is, and that must be the starting point of any assessment of relevant alternatives. The second building block follows from the recognition that we begin with the here and now, and that is the compensation principle. Any shift in the rules of the game will change the nature of the payoffs in the game. Those who currently gain from the status quo will lose, while others currently not in a position of privilege with respect to existing institutions will gain from the change. The winners must compensate the losers in the proposed change, not because the losers have any normative claim to their existing benefits, but because unless compensated, the beneficiaries of the status quo will fight to defeat any proposed changes in the structure of rules. In Politics Without Romance, 1979, Buchanan argues that, it seems to be nothing more than simple and obvious wisdom to compare social institutions as they might exist rather than compare romantic models of how such institutions might be hoped to operate. Rule changes must be filtered by an analysis of knavery, both the arrogant and opportunistic varieties. A robust theory of political economy thus challenges both the assumption of omniscience and benevolence. By any comparison with politics, Buchanan argued, economic theory is simple, political exchange is far more complex than economic exchange within a system of well-defined and enforced property rights. There are two reasons for this. First, the set of political exchanges that produce agreement on the rules of the game must precede economic exchange. Orderly trade takes place within an established legal structure. Second, within the established legal structure, political exchanges produce external benefits and costs to a far greater extent than the simple rendering of two trading partners realizing the mutual gains from trade in the economy. There are two levels of political exchange that must be studied. The formation of the rules of the game is the constitutional level of analysis, and the strategic play of the political game within the established rules of the game, which constitutes the ordinary analysis of politics. In Buchanan's rendering of constitutional political economy, the two levels of analysis must be engaged, as you cannot answer the relevant questions unless the social philosophical analysis of good rules is informed by the predictive analysis of how different political institutions will operate. The science of economics in this manner interacts with social philosophy to produce political economy. Section 4, A Stocktaking before proceeding. In examining briefly these three pivotal papers, an idea of what a Buchanan-inspired political economy looks like emerges, and with it, what such a political economist should do in their work. Economics is about exchange, and the institutions within which those exchanges take place. Political economists must recognize the two levels of analysis, and with the aid of the positive science of economics they can propose changes to the structural rules of the game. Neither the economist nor the political economist has a privileged position in the democratic process of collective decision-making, but the knowledge provided by the economist and the political economist is an essential input to understanding both, the political legal economic nexus and the efforts to reform that system through proposed changes in the rules. A Buchanan-inspired political economy exhibits the following characteristics. Analytically egalitarian agents. Behavioral symmetry of the actors in the different realms. Actors within political, legal, and market contexts are denied the assumptions of omniscience and omnipotence. The public purpose of the economist and political economist is to teach students about the principles of spontaneous order in the market economy, and the institutional arrangements that either are conducive to peaceful cooperation and productive specialization or thwart the efforts to realize social cooperation under the division of labor. To reflect on this a bit more, consider that Alexander Hamilton asked his readers in Federalist No. 1 whether the Constitution of the new nation would be the product of accident and force, or choice and reflection. Buchanan's answer 200 years later was that we should be unwilling to live by rules that are thrust upon us by accident and force. Instead, the political economist must opt for rules that come from choice and reflection, and that enable individuals to live better together. This is, in part, why Buchanan could declare why I, too, am not a conservative, 2005. Section 5, Post-Socialist Political Economy. The formative years of Buchanan's political economy were the decades following World War II, and in opposition to a formalistic version of economics which desensitized a generation of economists to comparative institutional analysis. The last decades of his career, however, saw a general recognition of the role of institutions in determining economic performance, particularly the role of private property rights and freedom to contract and trade. Buchanan's post-Nobel era coincided with the challenges of the post-socialist political economy. Institutional problems do indeed demand institutional solutions, but how do you get the process of institutional transformation underway in a world where the problem was precisely the institutional framework in the first place? The political economy reality of the 1990s and 2000s was a situation where for most of the pressing questions the world under examination was one defined by a dysfunctional institutional framework, and a population pool with great social divisions along ethnic and religious lines. In such an environment, how is it that the political economist can suggest a set of rules by which diverse groups can live by and in cooperation with one another? How can they turn their differences into advantages that can be successfully exploited? How can they turn their potential conflicts into opportunities for social cooperation? No doubt the growth of the social democratic welfare state in Western democracies in the post-World War II era represented a major intellectual challenge to classical liberal political economists. F. A. Hayek, Milton Friedman, and James Buchanan all rose to meet that challenge head-on in their respective ways in the 1940-1980s period. However, the problems of post-socialism were different, and the problems that post-socialism presented to the Western democracies themselves were also different. Consider the following passage from Buchanan and Tulloch's The Calculus of Consent. The evolution of democratic constitutions from the discussion of rational individuals can take place only under certain relatively narrowly defined conditions. The individual participants must approach the constitution-making process as equals in a special sense of this term. The requisite equality can be ensured only if the existing differences in external characteristics among individuals are accepted without rancor and if there are no clearly predictable bases among these differences for the formation of permanent coalitions. On the basis of purely economic motivation, individual members of a dominant and superior group, who consider themselves to be such and who were in the possession of power, would never rationally choose to adopt constitutional rules giving less fortunately situated individuals a position of equal partnership in governmental processes. On non-economic grounds the dominate classes might choose to do this, but, as experience has so often demonstrated in recent years, the less fortunately situated classes will rarely interpret such action as being advanced in their favor. Therefore, our analysis of the constitution-making process had little relevance for a society that is characterized by a sharp cleavage of the population into distinguishable social classes or separate racial, religious, or ethnic groupings sufficient to encourage the formation of predictable political coalitions and in which one of these coalitions has a clearly advantageous position at the constitutional stage, 1960–1999. Such cleavages are what emerge in the dysfunctional political economy of failed and weak states. See Rajan 2004, The inability to find rules that enable diverse groups to live in harmony with one another plagues not only the failed and weak states of Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, but also transitioning economies in East and Central Europe and the former Soviet Union. With the new wave of globalization in the last decade of the 20th century, the tensions among groups in one country often spill over to tensions in other countries through the migration of conflict and disharmony. Buchanan and Tullock were quick to say that one should not be so quick to dismiss their analysis of constitution making in the face of diversity and conflict. So long as some mobility among groups is guaranteed, coalitions will tend to be impermanent. They insist that their analysis of the calculus of consent will only break down in a situation where a constitutional democratic order is, strictly speaking, impossible. I tend to agree with them that we should not overstate the intractability of rule establishment in even extremely unlikely circumstances. The sort of constitution making from the ground up that one finds in the work of Elinor Ostrom is, of course, such an example. Faced with the social dilemma of common pool resources, Ostrom, 1990, examined the great diversity of institutional forms that a variety of groups have stumbled upon in their effort to govern the commons. She identified across cultures and across time various long and enduring practices that were, at the local level, successful at avoiding the predicted outcome of the tragedy of the commons. How? Well, it is important to remember the distinction between form and function in rules, or to use her language, rules in form versus rules in use in the institutional analysis of development. To boil down the argument, faced with a commons problem, economists typically suggest that assignment of private property rights will solve the dilemma. But how? Property rights internalize the costs and benefits of decisions on resource use, and they do so by assigning responsibility, limiting the access of others to the use of your property, and establishing penalties when others violate your property rights. The fascinating aspect of Ostrom's work is the diverse institutional arrangements adopted by groups of individuals in their effort to govern the commons that are functionally equivalent to private property rights in limiting access, assigning responsibility, and introducing penalties, but do not take the particular form of private property rights. The reason I bring up Ostrom's work in relation to Buchanan and post-socialist political economy is that her work forces us to consider the move away from an exogenous rule formation process, as Buchanan argued in classic papers such as Ethical Rules, Expected Values, and Large Numbers, 1965. If the rules of the game are to be analyzed as parametric, then the sort of intractability in the face of cleavage is a serious problem for the relevance of the calculus of consent to the problems political economists have been grappling with since 1989, and especially since 2001. This is not the intellectual fate of Buchanan's political economy if, instead, we can agree that what we have learned is simply the primacy of the framework in political economy analysis, and that we should take Buchanan's own plea seriously. The economist should not be content with postulating models and then working within such models. His task includes the derivation of the institutional order itself from the set of elementary behavioral hypotheses with which he commences, 1968. Institutional problems demand institutional solutions, and those institutional solutions are found in a blend of constructivism and spontaneous order. They do not condemn us to either pure accident and force or choice and reflection. Although Buchanan certainly had reservations about an evolutionary approach of rule formation, his contractarianism cannot be written off as entirely inconsistent with it. Consider this quote by Hayek in Volume 1 of Law, Legislation, and Liberty. At the moment our concern must be made clear that while the rules on which a spontaneous order rests, may also be of spontaneous origin, this need not always be the case. Although undoubtedly an order originally formed itself spontaneously because the individuals followed rules which had not been deliberately made but had arisen spontaneously, people gradually learned to improve those rules, and it is at least conceivable that the formation of a spontaneous order relies entirely on rules that were deliberately made, 1973. The point that Hayek makes about individuals learning to improve rules is where he intersects with Buchanan. If positive economics as a non-normative science teaches us to put constraints on our utopias, then it also puts constraints on our choices of the rules during the constitutional moment. In this sense, Buchanan's and Hayek's insights are not mutually exclusive, but inform us how rules are adopted by individuals. Although the Constitutional Convention was based on the choice and reflection of the Founding Fathers, the constraints on the utopia they wished to establish had evolved in England centuries before based on a common law tradition. Their choice and reflection was not an act of pure rational constructivism, but a conscious, yet learned adoption of previously evolved rules upon which they wished to improve. Indeed, the conscious adoption of rules by choice and reflection is not the creation of rules ex nihilo, but the recognition and awareness of which rules has served us best over time, including those rules that may have originally been thrust upon us by accident and force. As Buchanan stated, political economy has a non-normative role in discovering what is the structure of individual values, 1959. It is through the individual's rational experimentation within groups struggling to cope with social dilemmas, and the testing of rules that may turn situations of dire conflict into opportunities for peaceful social cooperation and productive specialization among free individuals that we find the evolving constitutional order. This sort of examination of the endogenous formation of the framework of rules even in the hard cases, see Leeson 2010, has, in my opinion, the potential to capture the imagination of a new generation of political economists. It has historical roots in the evolved constitutional structure of England, and thus blends with elements of a constitutional construction among the Founding Fathers in the United States. The positive political economy of endogenous rule formation is directly applicable to the study of reform efforts in failed and weak states. As Rajan, 2004, argued, the orthodox model, which assumes a working institutional framework that protects property rights and ensures freedom of contract, is simply not helpful for the study of much of the political economy of the world. A conventional reading of Buchanan might suggest that the sort of analysis that he provides of the constitutional contract in, say, The Limits of Liberty, 1975-2000, conflicts with the sort of endogenous rule formation that we have been talking about. But that tension, I want to suggest, is only apparent. First, the reader should keep in mind Buchanan's promise that a genuine institutional economics would follow from the economists studying the derivation of the institutional framework itself from the ordinary behavioral postulates they work with. Second, there are at least two social dilemmas that Buchanan's project in constitutional political economy identifies. The first is the problem of private predation that he attempts to capture in his depiction of the Hobbesian jungle. But once the monopoly apparatus of coercion is established, i.e., the state, then the analysis must turn to curbing the possibility of public predation. This leads to the enduring puzzle of political economy that Buchanan identified so clearly: how can we empower the protective and productive state without unleashing the redistributive state? The classical liberal political economist should be prepared, as Buchanan was, to grapple with the tough issues of distributive justice that justify the demands for the expansion of the redistributive state. Here again, technical economics on factor pricing and wage determination must align with the more dynamic and process-oriented theory of the market economy, and become the background information of the social philosophical discussion of the justice of the liberal order. The Buchanan vision of political economy is one where the structure of the rules permit neither discrimination nor dominion in the body politic. While not a romantic conception of political economy, it is an inspiring normative aspiration, and one that follows naturally from the consistent and persistent application of the rule of law to issues of political arrangements and public policy. Section 6, Slapped by the Invisible Hand? The Financial Crisis of 2008. In a somewhat shocking manner, the financial crisis of 2008 had a profound impact on Buchanan. He believed that the crisis demonstrated the intellectual excess of undisciplined libertarianism, and the intellectual bankruptcy of the new Chicago School of Economics as opposed to the old Chicago School of Economics in which he was educated. His reasoning was straightforward: how markets function is a consequence of the rules of the game under which they operate. It is always important to stress that a free market is not a market free of rules. If the rules are rigged so that you can privatize profit but socialize risk, then don't be surprised when individuals engage in riskier behavior. Absent the institutional environment, markets are not capable of operating in the same manner as in the presence of private property rights institutions. The New Chicago School, Buchanan argues, had proceeded in their analysis of financial markets and the macroeconomy as a whole as if institutions didn't matter and the invisible hand of the market economy could be relied upon to guide markets on the right path independent of the framework of rules governing the economic game. Of course, the idea that economists assume that self-interest alone could result in social order is not new to the modern Chicago School economists. But this actually isn't the position that Adam Smith held. Smith's professors in Glasgow and in Oxford are both pursuing their self-interest, but the systemic incentives produced under the different payment schemes of the respective schools impacts the behavior of the professors. The same is true of the behavior of religious leaders in a state-sponsored church versus religious leaders in a church that must compete each Sunday to put individual souls in the seats in need of saving, and put dollars in the collection plate to pay for the spending. Basic economic reasoning from the time of Adam Smith up through to James Buchanan stressed that the self-interest hypothesis must be squared with the invisible hand postulate not through a set of additional behavioral postulates, but through a thoroughgoing institutional analysis. It is true that the butcher, the baker, and the brewer provide our dinner not due to feelings of solidarity and benevolence, but as result of their pursuit of self-interest. The point, however, is that their self-interest guides them to coordinate the division of labor so we can enjoy our dinner precisely because they operate within a system of property, prices, and profit/loss. Absent the 3 Ps of property, prices, and profit/loss, individuals will be devoid of the incentives and information required to continually innovate and coordinate their plans to realize the gains from trade and the gains from innovation. The collapse of communism in the late 1980s, and the collapse of the house of cards that constituted modern finance in the 2000s, have both demonstrated the necessity of the institutional framework in any political economy analysis of our world. Markets operate in a socially efficient manner if and only to the extent they are embedded in a set of rules that guides them in that direction. Absent a framework of rules concerning property, contract, and consent, the market system is likely to be dysfunctional. The financial crisis of 2008 demonstrates not that the invisible hand can slap, but that even the most robust and capable hand cannot function if the skeletal structure is broken or absent. Conclusion. James Buchanan, in describing the formation of the Thomas Jefferson Center for Studies in Political Economy, stated that the scholars associated with the center strive to carry on the honorable tradition of political economy, the study of what makes for a good society. Political economists stress the technical economic principles that one must understand in order to assess alternative arrangements for promoting peaceful cooperation and productive specialization among free men. Yet political economists go further and frankly try to bring out into the open the philosophical issues that necessarily underlie all discussions of the appropriate functions of government and all proposed economic policy measures. That basic message as to what the classical liberal political economist should do remains the same. It falls on each generation of political economists to embrace the challenges of their day, while at the same time stressing the enduring principles of the discipline that can be traced back to Adam Smith and the great scientific conversation that he initiated. Political economists study exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place, and examine how alternative institutional arrangements either promote or hinder the realization of social cooperation under the division of labor. Buchanan often described himself as a pessimist when he looked to the future, but an optimist when he looked backward in time because the situation hasn't turned out as bad as he thought it would. It is my sincere hope that in embracing a Buchanan-inspired political economy, and facing the challenges of our time, as we go forward with our research and teaching, the vision of a classical liberal order of a society of free and responsible individuals will inspire the intellectually curious and imbue in them greater social understanding, and ultimately be a cause for optimistic social change. The end.